Just a week. That is what Dr. Marcus Whitfield said 18 minutes before everything he'd built began to collapse, though he had no idea the reckoning was already walking through his hospital doors. Katie Morrison moved through Seattle General's ICU in Philadelphia with the kind of efficiency that made experienced nurses watch her twice. 3 months in, and something about the way she prepped trauma bays, the precise spacing of instruments, the muscle memory that guided her hands without hesitation, seemed older than her file suggested. She was 28. She moved like someone who'd been saving lives for twice that long. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm as she adjusted the endotracheal tube securing tape on her current patient, her fingers steady as surgical steel. Room for 12. Post-operative monitoring. The chart read Admiral Robert Chen, retired, 72 hours post-op from an abdominal resection. What the chart didn't say was that Naval Intelligence had placed Katie Morrison at Seattle General 6 months ago, embedded under deep cover to quietly monitor a high-value target they suspected was being hunted. The Admiral had operational knowledge about submarine deployments that 3 separate foreign intelligence agencies would kill to extract. Katie didn't think about the mission when she worked. The mission was background static. Right now she thought about oxygen saturation. The monitor showed 94%, stable, and about the 4 drip rate that needed adjusting by 0.3 milliliters per hour. She thought about the light pressure in the Admiral's chest cavity, the way his breathing pattern suggested minimal pain. She thought about the 847 small decisions that kept a man alive. She didn't think about the tarnished challenge coin turning in her pocket. That was older muscle memory. Bagram. 2019. The trauma tent where she'd run the surgical protocols under fire, where she'd learned that pain was information and that steady hands kept people breathing. The coin was bronze, scarred from shrapnel, stamped with a Navy Medical Services Corps insignia. She carried it the way other people carried lucky pennies, a talisman nobody understood because she'd never explained it. Never would. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as she finished her rounds, moving from room to room with practiced quietness. Her badge clattered softly against her sternum as she bent to check another monitor. The name on the badge read Katie Morrison, RN, which was true, just incomplete. Most people only ever saw the surface. Most people never needed to see anything else. The physician's lounge was 2 floors down, visible through a partial window as she passed. Dr. Whitfield stood at the center of a cluster of rotating residents, his posture the kind of confident that comes from 15 years of absolute authority. He was tall, silver-haired, the type of man who wore his surgical privileges like a crown. He was also angry, though Katie wouldn't understand the depth of that anger until later. She was new. She was competent in ways he couldn't quite articulate. And worst of all, she didn't seem impressed by him. That Morrison girl. His voice carried through the hallway loud enough for the residents to laugh on cue. I give her a week. Maybe less. She's got that wide-eyed look. Thinks she can save the world. He smiled like he'd made an observation instead of a prediction. They come in here thinking night shift in a major trauma center is some kind of calling. By day 7 they're crying in the bathroom. I've seen it 100 times. One of the residents, a young guy maybe 26, trying hard to impress the attending, nodded. How can you tell so fast? Idealism. Whitfield gestured with his coffee cup. It's like a disease. They don't understand that this place runs on hierarchy. You defer to people who've earned the right to lead. You learn your lane and stay in it. The ones who can't accept that? They burn out. They fold. It's natural selection. He took a sip. Morrison's already behind her days. Just watching her. Katie Morrison had heard every word. Her pace didn't change. Her jaw clenched, a tiny contraction of muscle, barely perceptible, a tension most people would miss. She had been trained to miss things, to notice what others overlooked. She'd learned that the body tells stories if you listen. Dr. Whitfield's story was simple. He saw threat in competence, he saw danger in anyone who didn't immediately accept his authority, and he decided she needed to be broken. He was going to be disappointed. She continued down the corridor toward the stairwell, her footsteps quiet on the hospital tile. The antiseptic smell was layered here, fresh bleach from the morning cleaning, mixed with the copper undertone of blood that no amount of mopping could quite erase, and underneath that, burnt coffee from the lounge where Whitfield still stood, still holding court. She'd heard similar assessments before. In Bagram. In the tent where enlisted personnel were just following orders and officers were essential to the chain of command. She'd seen hierarchies collapse when the real crisis came. Rank meant nothing when someone was bleeding to death. Authority meant nothing when hands were the only thing standing between a soldier and death. The coin in her pocket pressed against her ribs as she moved. She turned it over 3 times, a habit from years ago, a rhythm as automatic as breathing. Turn. 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 It helped her think. It also kept her calm, and she needed to be very calm right now. Because part of her wanted to turn around, walk back into that lounge, and explain to Dr. Whitfield exactly what she was. But that wasn't how this worked. Naval intelligence didn't embed people into situations to flex rank. You stayed invisible. You completed the assignment. You protected the target. Everything else was noise. Room for 12. Admiral Chen was sleeping, his chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. She checked the floor again, adjusted the flow rate with the kind of precision that came from having done this in combat conditions where one mistake meant one less heartbeat. The monitor showed stable vitals. The Admiral's color was good. His respiration steady at 14 breaths per minute. Everything was exactly as it should be. She looked at his face for a moment, older man, distinguished even in recovery, the kind of face that had seen things most people would never process. He was no threat right now. He was just a body that needed keeping alive. That was enough. That was always enough. The afternoon stretched ahead of her. More rounds, more monitoring, more invisibility. Whitfield would continue his assessment of her competence. The other nurses would continue their usual rotations. The Admiral would continue his recovery, unaware that a Navy intelligence operative was monitoring his vitals and watching for any sign that the foreign assets tracking him had made their move. And Katie Morrison would continue being exactly what everyone expected, a quiet, competent nurse with no history, no rank, no operational experience. Just another person in scrubs pushing a medication cart through a Philadelphia hospital. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was waiting. Because in exactly 48 hours, Dr. Whitfield was going to do something that would force her hand. Something that would destroy the cover she'd maintained for 6 months. Something that would make her choose between staying invisible and saving the Admiral's life. And that choice, that moment, was going to burn everything to the ground. For now, though, she had a patient who needed monitoring. She had a coin that needed turning. She had composure that needed maintaining. She had 7 days until Dr. Whitfield learned exactly what he'd challenged. 7 days until he understood that you don't measure people by the way they react to your authority. You measure them by what they do when everything falls apart. She turned the coin 3 more times. Turn. 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 And went back to work. 2 days after his public wager, Dr. Whitfield found Katie in the main corridor during morning rounds, walking with a cafeteria tray balanced in both hands, scrambled eggs, toast, orange juice, coffee. She didn't see him coming. His shoulder connected with the tray at precisely the right angle, and everything scattered across the tile floor in front of 12 rotating residents who had gathered for the attending's teaching rounds. Orange juice exploded across her white clogs. Egg yolk dripped down her scrub pants. The coffee cup rolled across the floor like it was looking for an exit. "Watch where you're going, honey," Whitfield said, not breaking stride, his voice pitched loud enough for everyone to hear. He smiled at the residents as if he'd just made a joke. A few of them smiled back. Katie's jaw clenched almost imperceptibly. 1 muscle. 1 second. That was the only sign that anything had registered. Her hands remained perfectly steady as she crouched beside the scattered tray, gathering the pieces methodically, the plastic dishes first, then the silverware, then the napkin soaked through with orange juice. Her face was a mask of professional neutrality, the kind of mask that takes years to cultivate, the kind worn by people who've learned that silence is its own kind of power. The residents watched. They always watched. Whitfield had made sure of that by timing his move for maximum visibility. This was stage 2 of his campaign, not just the rumor anymore, but public demonstration. This was him showing the nursing staff what happened to anyone who didn't know their place in the hospital hierarchy. Katie finished cleaning without a word. She stood up, tray in hand, and walked directly to the trash bin without making eye contact with anyone. Then she returned to her medication cart at the nurse's station and continued with her rounds as if nothing had happened. As if her scrubs weren't damp. As if her morning wasn't now 8 minutes behind schedule. As if the attending physician had just casually assaulted her in front of an audience. The surgical residents exchanged glances, the kind of quick look that carries entire conversations. They'd seen Whitfield break stronger nurses than this. Katie was quiet, competent, and now she was also damp and humiliated. It was only a matter of time. But that wasn't the worst part. That afternoon, during surgical team rounds in the main operating room, Katie was assisting with chart reviews when Whitfield deliberately dropped a patient file at her feet. It was a calculated move, the kind that can only be executed successfully when you've rehearsed the casual cruelty of it in your mind 100 times. The chart scattered across the floor, pages spilling everywhere, lab results mixing with imaging reports. 8 people stood in the room. 8 witnesses. "Pick that up, sweetheart," Whitfield said, his voice smooth as expensive scotch. "Since you're so eager to help." His smile didn't reach his eyes. It never did. His eyes were the color of a hospital wall before it's painted, blank, institutional, without depth or warmth. Katie's hand stayed perfectly steady. No trembling. No hesitation. She crouched down and gathered the scattered pages, organizing them back into the patient file with the kind of methodical precision that suggested she was filing her own thoughts away instead. She didn't meet Whitfield's eyes. She didn't acknowledge the insult. She didn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. She simply finished her work and returned the chart to his hands as if she'd been asked to do him a professional favor. Then she continued her medication rounds as if he'd said nothing at all. The surgical team watched her move through the room, the steady hands, the focused eyes, the absolute refusal to crumble. Something shifted in their expressions. Whitfield was waiting for tears, or anger, or that particular brand of public resignation that breaks a person's will. Instead, he got a woman who moved like someone who'd already survived worse things than being humiliated in front of colleagues. Someone whose composure had the quality of something forged rather than taught. Whitfield's jaw tightened slightly. That was the micro-expression of a man who wasn't getting the reaction he'd planned for. The next day, he tried a different approach. During a family conference in the patient's room, Whitfield deliberately mispronounced Katie's name. "Kathy, can you pull the lab results?" Not a mistake. An act. He watched her face as he corrected himself with exaggerated apology, the kind of false contrition that's actually a second humiliation. "Sorry, Katie. All you girls look the same in those scrubs." He directed this comment at the family with a smile that suggested camaraderie, as if they were all in on the same joke together. The family laughed uncertainly. Katie met Whitfield's eyes for exactly 2 seconds, just long enough for him to see that she'd understood exactly what he was doing and didn't care. Then she returned to documenting vitals on the bedside monitor, her movement smooth and clinical. Nothing rattled. Nothing broke. But that evening, alone in the supply closet during her break, her hands gripped the metal shelf with enough force that her knuckles went white. The challenge coin in her pocket felt heavier than it had that morning, the weight of 2 identities, both demanding different things, both pulling in opposite directions. One wanted her to report Whitfield to hospital administration. The other knew that would draw exactly the kind of attention she couldn't afford. One wanted her to walk out and never return. The other knew Admiral Chen was still somewhere in this hospital, still vulnerable, still depending on her to keep watching. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like agitated insects. That sound, that constant mechanical hum that only hospital workers seem to notice, had become the soundtrack to her day. Buzz and beep and the distant sound of a ventilator somewhere down the corridor. Sounds that meant someone was fighting to breathe. Sounds that meant people were hurting. She pulled the challenge coin from her pocket and turned it over in her palm. The Navy Medical Services Corps insignia caught the fluorescent light. Bagram, 2019. That was who she was. That was what she'd done. That was the kind of person who didn't flinch when someone knocked a cafeteria tray out of her hands. But none of that mattered here. Here, she was just a nurse. Just another person in scrubs that all looked the same, according to Whitfield. She gripped the coin tighter and forced her breathing to steady. In through the nose. Out through the mouth. The same technique she'd taught soldiers in field medicine courses. The same technique she'd used after Bagram, after extraction, after the debriefs that classified half of what she'd survived. When she returned to the floor 15 minutes later, her face was restored to its professional mask. Her movements were precise again. Her voice was level and deferential. Katie Morrison, the quiet nurse who never complained, who kept her head down, who seemed willing to accept whatever the hospital hierarchy decided was appropriate treatment. But something had shifted in the operating room that afternoon. Something the surgical residents had noticed. Something that made Whitfield begin asking different kinds of questions, not about her performance, because her performance was flawless, but about her background. Why a nurse with her skills worked night rotation in post-op recovery instead of trying to advance to a supervisory position. Why her references were so sparse. Why she never seemed to apply for promotions or demonstrate the kind of ambition that normally drives people upward through the medical hierarchy. And it was those questions that started to matter because they meant Whitfield was beginning to see something he couldn't quite categorize. Someone who didn't fit the expected patterns. Someone whose composure was too practiced, whose hands were too steady, whose refusal to break under pressure suggested a kind of training that didn't come from nursing school. But that wasn't the worst part, because that same afternoon, during an emergency admission to the trauma bay, Admiral Robert Chen was wheeled in on a stretcher with a pulmonary complication that would change everything. The emergency thoracotomy tray was already open when Admiral Robert Chen rolled into Trauma Bay 3, his left lung collapsing like a building losing structural integrity. Katie moved before anyone assigned her a position, her hands finding their muscle memory the way divers find the surface in darkness, 14 years of combat medicine waking up inside her ribs. The surgical field opened. She didn't hesitate. She didn't second-guess. She moved like someone who had done this in a tent in Helmand Province with mortar fire walking closer every 8 seconds, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst this world could offer. Dr. Whitfield barked orders from the head of the table, his voice tight with the particular anxiety of a man who knew he was being watched. The attending surgeon from cardiothoracics hadn't arrived yet, 3 minutes out, someone said, and Whitfield was running the show. His hands moved, but they moved like a man reading instructions for the first time. Katie could see it in the way he approached each step, the hesitation before the clamp, the slight tremor in his wrist when he reached for the spreader. She'd seen that before. Fear looked the same whether it was in a hospital in Philadelphia or a combat support hospital in Bagram with IED casualties stacked like cordwood outside the tent. The incision widened. Blood filled the field in slow, terrible accumulation. Someone pushed blood products. The monitor beeped its mechanical rhythm, a sound like a metronome counting down to something terrible. Whitfield's jaw tightened. He leaned closer to the wound, his face suddenly uncertain, suddenly small. That was when Katie's hands moved on their own, reaching for the vascular clamp, a satin sky, the kind she'd used hundreds of times, the kind her fingers recognized the weight of before her eyes even registered the instrument. The bleeding artery. There. 2 inches south of the intercostal space. She positioned the clamp with the precision of someone who had clamped bleeders while lying in mud with rain hammering down, while knowing that if she hesitated even 1 second, someone's child would not come home. The clamp seated. The bleeding stopped. Whitfield stared at her hands like he was watching something impossible unfold. A resident gasped, actually audibly gasped, because what Katie had just done required a kind of anatomical knowledge and kinesthetic memory that didn't come from the standard nursing curriculum. The silence that followed was the silence of people realizing they were standing next to something they didn't understand. Admiral Chen's eyes opened then, consciousness returning like a man surfacing from deep water. His gaze found Katie's across the surgical field, and recognition flickered behind his pupils, the kind of recognition that comes from having survived together, from sharing the specific knowledge of combat medicine that only people who've lived through it can truly possess. His lips moved, barely forming words, and she read them before he spoke them aloud. Bagram. 2019, you were the Master Chief who ran the trauma tent. The words hung in the air between them like a detonation she could feel but not see. Katie's eyes met his immediately, a single sharp glance that carried an entire conversation, silence. Not here. Not now. Not with Whitfield standing 3 feet away, still processing what he'd witnessed, still constructing explanations that would never accommodate the truth. She turned back to the field without breaking expression, her jaw tightening almost imperceptibly, her hands remaining steady as a surgical laser. To anyone watching, it was just a nurse acknowledging a patient's confusion. To anyone who knew what to look for, it was the recognition of 2 warriors who'd held the line together in a place most people would call hell. The rest of the procedure moved forward like clockwork. Whitfield's hands had found their rhythm again, though Katie could see the rigidity in his shoulders, the way he was compensating, overcompensating, trying to prove something to the residents who were now watching him with the first seeds of doubt. The Admiralty patient stabilized. The bleeding came under control. By the time they wheeled Chen to the recovery unit 2 hours later, his vitals had normalized into something almost boring: oxygen saturation 98%, heart rate 76, blood pressure holding steady at 118/74. That evening, Katie sat in her car in the Seattle General parking garage, engine dead, her hands gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing tethering her to gravity. The challenge coin was in her pocket, the tarnished one with the Navy Medical Services Corps insignia worn smooth by 18 years of carrying it, of turning it over in her pocket during moments when the mask threatened to slip. She pulled it out now, felt its weight in her palm, the specific gravity of a secret that could burn everything to the ground if it ever escaped. 6 months. That's how long she'd been at Seattle General, embedded here under deep cover by naval intelligence, her license legitimate but her reasons for being here anything but. Admiral Robert Chen had been the assignment. Protect. Monitor. Observe. The intelligence community suspected he was being targeted by a foreign intelligence operation trying to access classified information about submarine deployments, the kind of operational security breach that could shift the balance of power in 3 different theaters. She'd been the insurance policy, a guardian angel in scrubs, positioned close enough to intervene if the threat manifested into something actual. But she'd broken protocol. She'd just revealed herself to him in a surgical suite. He'd recognized her, and that recognition had been mutual and witnessed by people who would start asking questions. The mission was burning. The compartmentalization she'd maintained for 6 months, the quiet competence, the deference, the way she'd let Dr. Whitfield humiliate her without flinching, all of it was designed to keep her invisible, to keep her in the background where no one thought to look too closely. And now one afternoon in a trauma bay had potentially compromised everything. She turned the coin over again, watching how the fluorescent lights of the garage caught the scratched surface. This was what she carried. This was what she'd earned in Bagram in 2019, when she'd been running a trauma tent with 14 combat medics, saving soldiers who should have died in the field, holding the line so that people like Admiral Chen could continue their missions, continue protecting the people they loved. She'd been the Master Chief then. She'd been someone. And then she'd come here and become nobody, just another nurse that a doctor like Whitfield could knock trays from and throw patient charts at, someone he could dismiss with a single condescending word. The parking garage was almost empty. Just the sound of distant traffic on the street above and the fluorescent lights humming their electric song. Katie closed her eyes and felt the weight of it all, the cover identity pressing down like a concrete slab, the Admiral upstairs still vulnerable despite her intervention, the residency program that would start asking questions about a nurse who moved like a trauma surgeon, whose hands had knowledge they shouldn't possess. She hadn't planned for this. You didn't plan for the past to walk through the trauma bay doors on a stretcher with a pulmonary complication and blow your entire operation wide open with a single glance of recognition. The challenge coin felt heavier than it had this morning. 7 days after the thoracotomy, Admiral Chen's heart stopped pretending everything was fine. His post-op check was supposed to be routine, vitals, drainage assessment, maybe discharge planning by week's end. Instead, his blood pressure collapsed like a building with its support beams removed. 118/72. 100/60. 89/54. The numbers fell in real time, his body betraying the surgeon's handiwork in a way no one had anticipated. Katie was 3 floors up, restocking medication carts in the ICU, when the alarm sounded over the intercom. Code blue. Cardiothoracic flaw. Not her patient. Not her responsibility. She kept her hand steady, kept moving, kept her face neutral because she'd learned that the quietest people could hear thunder in the silence. But her body knew before her brain did. The way her breath caught. The way her fingers paused over the vials. By the time she reached the cardiothoracic ward, Dr. Whitfield was already there, ultrasound probe in his trembling hand. His hands were shaking. Not from fear. From rage at circumstances he couldn't control, couldn't bully into submission. Admiral Chen lay on the bed, his skin the color of old paper, his chest heaving as the ventilator fought to push oxygen into failing lungs. The monitor showed sinus tachycardia. Pressure dropping. Oxygen saturation falling like a stone through dark water. Whitfield stared at the ultrasound screen, the probe moving uselessly across Chen's chest wall. He wasn't looking for the pericardial effusion, he'd already found it. The dark fluid pooling around the heart like a noose tightening. Cardiac tamponade. The surgeon's nightmare. The body's way of saying the fix had introduced a new problem. A small bleed into the pericardial sac, unnoticed, accumulating millimeter by millimeter until the heart had no room left to beat. Get cardiothoracic back, Whitfield said, his voice tight. Get them now. No one moved fast enough. The cardiologist was in OR, unavailable for 15 minutes minimum. Maybe 20. 15 minutes was forever. 20 minutes was death. Katie stepped forward. The room felt like it was moving through honey, every second stretching, every breath a decision. She saw the problem the way soldiers see an ambush, not as data but as a geometry of survival. The fluid. The pressure. The needle. Move. Her voice came out quiet as a scalpel. Not a request. Not a question. Whitfield looked at her with the expression of a man who'd just been contradicted by furniture. His face reddened. His mouth opened. But something in her stillness, something in the way she'd spoken that single word, made him step back instead of forward. Katie grabbed a spinal needle from the crash cart. 18 gauge. She didn't hesitate. Didn't ask permission. Didn't apologize. Her hands moved on their own, muscle memory older than her nursing license, older than her cover, older than her ability to pretend she was someone she wasn't. She found the 5th intercostal space. Located the xiphoid process. Her fingers moved with the precision of a compass drawing a perfect circle. The needle went in. The syringe filled with blood. 60 milliliters of it. Dark red, almost black in the harsh light. The pressure in the pericardial sac released like the opening of a valve. Chen's oxygen saturation climbed. 101. 104. The rhythm on the monitor stabilized. The blood pressure rose like someone waking from a nightmare. 112/70. 118/74. 45 seconds. That's all it took. In that same moment, as Chen's eyes fluttered open and his breathing eased, Katie reached down and slipped the tarnished challenge coin into his palm. The one she'd carried in her scrub pocket for 6 months. The one with the Navy Medical Services Corps insignia worn smooth by decades of hands older than hers. She pressed his fingers closed around it without a word. The message was contained in the gesture. The recognition was mutual. The silence between them held everything that couldn't be said aloud. Whitfield watched from the corner, his face the color of ash. He didn't move. Didn't speak. Didn't try to take credit or explain or defend what had just happened in front of a room full of witnesses who all understood exactly what they'd seen. A nurse had performed an invasive procedure that belonged in a doctor's hands. A nurse had saved an admiral's life. A nurse had done the thing that doctors train for years to accomplish, and she'd done it in the time most people take to answer a phone. By 1 o'clock that afternoon, the entire hospital knew. Nurses whispered in break rooms. Residents discussed it in the physician's lounge. The attending surgeons who'd trained for a decade recognized the procedure with a single glance at Admiral Chen's chart. A pericardiocentesis. Perfect technique. Perfect timing. Perfect outcome. The problem wasn't that she'd saved him. The problem was that only a Master Chief Petty Officer should have known how to do it that way. Whitfield made his phone calls from his office. 3 of them. The first was to his mentor on the hospital board, a man who'd taught him that authority was built on the backs of people afraid to challenge it. The second was to the Pennsylvania State Board of Nursing, claiming unauthorized invasive procedures, breach of scope of practice, potential endangerment of a patient. The third was to a contact at the Joint Commission, threatening to expose credential verification failures that could trigger a federal investigation. By dawn, Katie Morrison's badge was flagged in the system. When she swiped it at the entrance scanner at 6:43 a.m., it didn't beep. It just failed. The light went red. The reader clicked. Access denied. Security found her in the corridor, still in her jacket, not yet through the doors. Ms. Morrison. Come with us, please. Not a question. Not a request. Just the same tone she'd used 7 hours earlier, except the power was inverted. She followed them up 6 flights and through the administrative wing where the air smelled like expensive coffee and career calculations. The chief nursing officer was waiting with folded hands. HR sat beside her. A hospital attorney in a charcoal suit stood near the window, the morning light making him look like he'd been carved from marble. You're on administrative leave pending a full review, the CNO said. Effective immediately. Your badge has been deactivated. We'll need your credentials and access cards. Katie handed them over without speaking. The temperature of the room seemed to drop with every second of her silence. The incident with Admiral Chen, the attorney said, adjusting his glasses. Performing a pericardiocentesis without physician supervision. Without even notifying the attending physician that you were intervening. Do you understand the liability you created for this institution? The Admiral's alive, Katie said. Her voice was level. Flat. The voice of someone stating a fact, not defending a position. That's not the point, HR said. It's exactly the point, Katie replied. Then nothing more. No explanation. No justification. No apology. The silence stretched out like a rope hanging in dark water, and everyone in that room understood that they were looking at someone who had made peace with loss before they'd even asked the question. By noon, her locker had been searched. Her personal items placed in a box. Her work schedule removed from the rotation boards. By evening, her name was no longer in the system at all. She'd become what she never was supposed to be in the first place, invisible. That night, Katie sat in her car in the Seattle General parking garage, engine dead, her forehead pressed against the steering wheel. Outside, the Philadelphia rain fell in sheets, hammering the windshield like someone trying to break through glass. The garage lights flickered in that way that made everything look like a memory. The mission was burned. Admiral Chen's protection detail, the quiet observation, the embedded operative watching for the 2 to 4 a.m. visitor who never quite materialized but cast a shadow over his recovery nonetheless, all of it was gone. Whitfield had seen to that. 3 phone calls had dismantled 6 months of careful placement. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Encrypted message from her handler, maintain cover. Do not break protocol. How? How was she supposed to maintain cover when her cover was the only thing left and it was dissolving like salt in water? She was a nurse with a nursing license so real it had fooled everyone except the one man who needed fooling the least. She was a Master Chief Petty Officer with military qualifications she could never explain. She was phantom to 3 different intelligence agencies and Katie Morrison to a hospital that had just destroyed her. The challenge coin was back in her pocket now, returned by hospital security after the search, nothing interesting about a worn military souvenir, nothing worth confiscating. She turned it over in her fingers again and again, the tarnished surface catching the edge of the parking garage light. On one side, the Navy Medical Services Corps insignia. On the other, a date carved so small you could barely read it, Bagram, 2019. For the first time in her career, she didn't know what to do. The next move wasn't hers to make. The handler would call. The orders would come. But sitting in that car, with the rain hammering and the fluorescent lights humming their mechanical funeral dirge, Katie Morrison wasn't a nurse and wasn't quite a soldier and wasn't anyone at all. She was just someone who'd saved a life and lost everything, and she was waiting for someone to tell her if that was supposed to mean something or if it was just another cost of doing business in the dark. The rain had stopped. That was the first thing Katie noticed when she woke up in her car at 4:44 a.m. The parking garage was silent except for the distant hum of ventilation, and the windshield was bone dry. She'd slept 2 hours before her body jerked awake with the old combat reflex, that sudden gasp from dreams of Bagram dust and screaming and the weight of another soldier's arm around her shoulders. Her badge was gone. Her locker had been photographed. Her future was a filing cabinet in some administrator's office, and she still had no idea if Admiral Chen had survived the night or if his heart had stopped again after she'd been escorted out by security. She was reaching for the ignition when the sound came. Not a siren. Not an ambulance. The distinctive double thump of rotor blades cutting through Philadelphia air, rhythmic, purposeful, impossible to mistake. Katie's hands went very still on the steering wheel. The sound grew louder, closer, becoming something she felt in her chest before she heard it with her ears. A helicopter. Military grade. UH-60M Black Hawk by the rotor signature. She knew that sound the way other people knew rain or thunder. It was the voice of home. She didn't move from her car. She watched the rotor wash kick up debris in the parking garage entrance, watched the security light strobe across her windshield like a warning beacon. The Black Hawk didn't land in the parking lot. It went up. Over the hospital, toward the rooftop helipad. Katie's jaw tightened. Military brass didn't land on civilian hospital rooftops for casual business. They landed like that when they were coming for something, or someone. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She answered because she was trained to answer. Master Chief. A woman's voice, clipped. Military. We're on the roof. The head of security is expecting us. We've got authorization directly from Naval Intelligence. Stand by. The line went dead. Katie sat in the darkness of the parking garage, hands gripping the wheel, and for the first time in 72 hours, she allowed herself to breathe. They found her at 5:13 a.m. in the administrative wing. For Navy personnel in dress uniforms, 2 officers, 2 enlisted, walking through the hospital like they owned it, their shoes clicking against tile in perfect synchronized rhythm. The head of security, a Marine veteran named Holloway, went pale when he saw them. He looked at Katie standing in that corridor with her deactivated badge still clipped to her jacket, and he said something very quietly into his radio, something that made the other security guards step away from the doors. The lead officer, a full commander, looked at Katie and said, "Phantom." She didn't flinch. She'd buried that call sign so deep in the Seattle general cover that hearing it spoken in a Philadelphia hospital hallway felt like a crack in the fabric of reality. But her voice didn't shake. "That's me. We need to move. Now." The boardroom was already in session when they arrived. 7 hospital administrators, 3 members from the nursing board, and Dr. Marcus Whitfield sitting at the head of the table with papers spread in front of him like a case he'd already won. His face went the color of old bone when the 4 Navy personnel walked in. Katie walked in behind them, and the silence that followed could have been measured with an instrument. A rear admiral stepped forward, 3 stars on her shoulder, the kind of woman who didn't introduce herself because people already knew who she was. She was holding a folder the thickness of a dictionary. "I need to read something into the record," the admiral said. Her voice had the weight of command. "This is the service record of Master Chief Petty Officer Katie Morrison, United States Navy, Naval Intelligence Directorate." Whitfield stood up. "There's been a misunderstanding." "That nurse." "Sit down, Doctor." The admiral didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She opened the folder and began to read. Bronze Star for operations in Sanjin Valley, Helm and Province. Bronze Star for rescue of 4 personnel under fire near Forward Operating Base Shank. Bronze Star for tactical assessment and medical intervention during the 2019 Bagram convoy ambush. She paused. And a Navy Cross, the highest decoration for valor short of the Medal of Honor, for extraction of 12 wounded soldiers under sustained enemy fire in Bagram, March 2019. The room didn't just go silent. It stopped existing. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed to pause their mechanical hum. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The admiral continued reading like she was the only person in the universe. Master Chief Morrison's current operational assignment was embedded at Seattle General Hospital as a protective detail and intelligence asset assigned to Admiral Robert Chen, retired. Her mission was classified at the highest level. Her presence here was not optional. Her actions were authorized. Whitfield's hand was shaking. Katie watched it, the tremor starting at his fingertips, spreading up his wrist like a disease. This was the moment he understood that he hadn't been playing chess. He'd been playing against someone who'd been carrying weapons he couldn't see. The door behind them opened. Admiral Chen, still in a hospital gown but standing under his own power, walked into that boardroom carrying something in his closed fist. His eyes found Katie first, held hers for exactly 1 second, and then he opened his hand. The tarnished military challenge coin. The same one she'd pressed into his palm during the code, the signal that meant everything was going to be okay. He held it up so the light caught the Navy Medical Services Corps insignia, and he said, "This is a coin from the unit that saved my son's life in Afghanistan in 2017. My boy was 18 years old, Marine Expeditionary Force, got hit with shrapnel in a firefight outside Musa Kala. The medical team that pulled him off that battlefield, the Master Chief who ran that trauma operation, was standing in this hospital the entire time, making sure nothing happened to me." His voice cracked. "Once. Just once. She already saved one life I cared about. She saved mine 3 days ago. And that man," he pointed at Whitfield, "tried to destroy her for it." Whitfield's face went from bone white to something darker, something like a man watching his future burn. He reached for the papers in front of him, the complaints, the documentation, the carefully filed evidence of Katie's alleged misconduct, and he started talking. Fast. Desperate. Saying that she'd overstepped, that she was untrained, that the pericardiocentesis could have killed the admiral, that she had no authority to. She had all the authority she needed, the rear admiral said. She had a Navy Cross. You have a medical license that expired 3 days ago pending investigation. The investigation. Whitfield didn't know about the investigation yet. Katie watched the realization hit him, Holloway standing in the corner with a radio to his ear, security footage being pulled, colleagues being interviewed. The thing he'd set in motion when he made those 3 phone calls had spun around like a weapon and pointed back at him. Within 72 hours, a viral video was spreading across medical social media. Someone had recorded Whitfield in the cafeteria on their phone, the tray flying from Katie's hands, his voice loud enough to carry, "Pick that up, sweetheart." The footage was 8 seconds long. It was enough. It moved from nursing forums to medical ethics boards to general social media, and by the time it reached Johns Hopkins, it had been watched 200,000 times. Whitfield's former mentor, the man who'd championed his career for 15 years, who'd written his recommendation letters and opened doors in operating rooms across the country, saw that video. He released a public statement that was covered by the Philadelphia Inquirer. "This behavior represents everything I spent my career trying to eliminate from medicine. I was profoundly wrong about Dr. Whitfield's character. I cannot, in good conscience, remain silent while someone of this temperament operates on patients in any facility." The board initiated a full review. Staff members came forward with complaints that had been quietly buried for years, complaints about his language, his treatment of nurses, his pattern of blaming colleagues for his own surgical decisions. The Joint Commission investigation he'd weaponized against Katie pivoted to examine him instead. Within 2 weeks, his surgical privileges were suspended. Within 4 weeks, Seattle General terminated his contract. His calls to other hospitals went unreturned. The medical community is small. Smaller than Whitfield had realized. Once you're marked as someone who destroys people to protect your reputation, no one wants you anywhere near their operating rooms. The nursing board reviewed his complaints against Katie and formally withdrew them with written apologies. Naval intelligence released just enough classified documentation to make it clear that she'd been operating under direct orders, and even that brief glimpse of the truth was enough. Admiral Chen, fully recovered and back in his dress uniform, made sure every regulatory body, every insurance company, every credentialing committee understood exactly who had saved his life and why. 6 months later, the Pentagon auditorium was filled with officers in dress blues, the kind of formal ceremony where every uniform was pressed into knife-edged creases and every shoe reflected the light like a mirror. Katie Morrison stood on that stage in her own dress blues, the fabric still stiff from being pressed, the insignia on her shoulders catching the spotlights. In her hand was her challenge coin. The tarnished one. Except it wasn't tarnished anymore. Somewhere in the past 6 months, someone at Naval Intelligence had taken it to a jeweler, had it polished to a mirror shine, had her service dates engraved on the back. Now it was pinned to her uniform, right next to her medals. All of them. The Bronze Stars in ascending order, the Navy Cross last, catching the light like a promise. Admiral Chen stood next to her in full dress whites, his admiral's board brilliant against the dark uniform. He shook her hand in front of the assembled officers, a gesture so formal it almost cracked the facade of professionalism. Almost. His eyes were wet. "True class," he said, his voice steady again, carrying across the auditorium, "is what you do when the lights go out. When nobody's watching. When there's no medal at the end of it, no recognition, no validation. When doing the right thing costs you everything and you do it anyway." He looked at the officers seated in that auditorium. Master Chief Morrison did that every single day at Seattle General Hospital. While someone tried to break her. While someone tried to make her invisible. She kept showing up. She kept protecting people who didn't even know they needed protection. That's the definition of honor. The applause sounded like thunder rolling through the building. Meanwhile, Dr. Marcus Whitfield was standing in front of a room at Philadelphia Community College, holding a CPR dummy torso in his hands, trying to explain to a class of nursing assistants how to perform chest compressions. $18 an hour. No title. No authority. No operating room. No one who recognized his name except for the people who remembered why it was famous. Former colleagues crossed the street to avoid him. His calls to old friends went unreturned. The medical community had a very long memory, and it was very rarely merciful. Katie Morrison walked out of that Pentagon auditorium into the Washington sunlight, and Admiral Chen pressed something into her palm. Another challenge coin. This one from his own command, fresh and new and polished. He closed her fingers around it the same way she'd once passed hers to him during the code. The same signal. The same promise. Everything's going to be okay. She didn't know what to do with 2 challenge coins. So she held them both, one in each hand, and she finally understood what it meant to be seen. Not as a nurse. Not as a cover story. Not as someone threatening to a man's power. But as what she'd always been, a person worth protecting, worth honoring, worth knowing by her real name. That moment, standing in the sunlight with 2 coins in her hands and a room full of officers behind her who finally knew who she was, that was when Katie Morrison realized she didn't have to hide anymore. If you've ever been underestimated by someone in power, if you've ever had to prove your worth to people who refuse to see it, Katie Morrison's story is a reminder that the truth has a way of surfacing. Subscribe for more stories about the quiet people who change everything. Like and comment if you believe that heroes don't always wear the title they deserve.